Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russia claims to have destroyed various weapons, while Ukraine reports heavy fighting in multiple directions. Chief of General Staff of Russia's Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, shown for first time since failed June 24th mutiny. Plus, White House defends decision to send cluster munition to Ukraine as Russian embassy condemns the move. Thank you so much for joining us. The Russian military have destroyed various weapons in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, while the Ukrainian side said that its troops engaged in heavy fighting against the enemy in multiple directions. In its daily briefing, the Russian Defense Ministry said that in the past 24 hours, its forces had combat with Ukrainian troops in the direction of Kupiansk, in Krasny Liman, in Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and also Kherson, and destroyed Ukrainian tanks, armored vehicles, M109 self-propelled howitzers, M777 howitzers, US-made anti-artillery radar, and many other Ukrainian equipment and facilities. The Russian Air Defense Forces also intercepted Ukrainian drones and HIMARS rockets and shut down a Su-27 fighter. Meanwhile, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said that they'd dozens of battles with Russian troops in the directions of Kupiansk, Bakhmut, Marinka, and other areas over the past 24 hours. The Ukrainian Air Force, rocket forces, and artillery also attacked many Russian targets, including rally points with presence of Russian military personnel and equipment, air defense systems, command posts, ammunition depots, artillery positions, and electronic warfare platforms. Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff of Russia's Armed Forces, was shown by the Defense Ministry today listening to a report about Ukrainian missile attacks, his first appearance in public since the failed June 24th mutiny. The Defense Ministry said the footage showed him at a meeting on Sunday, sitting in a military command room on a white leather seat, speaking to top generals and giving orders, including the head of the military intelligence, the GRU. The Defense Ministry said in a statement which partly reads, the Chief of the General Staff of Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Army General Valery Gerasimov, set a task to the Chief of the Main Intelligence Directorate and those responsible for the command posts of the combined group to organize systematic work to identify storage and training sites, as well as the launch positions of S-200 missiles and similar enemy strike weapons, and plan their preemptive defeat. It said Russia had thwarted a Ukrainian missile attack on Crimea and the Rostov and Kaluga regions over the weekend. Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine back in 2014. Elsewhere, the Ukrainian and Polish presidents marked the anniversary of massacres of Poles by Ukrainian nationalists during World War II over the weekend, killings that have been a source of tension between the allies. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and his Polish counterpart attended a church service held in memory of the victims in the western Ukrainian city of Lutsk. Warsaw had positioned itself as one of Kiev's staunchest supporters since Russia invaded the country in 2022. However, the Volhynia massacre, in which historians say tens of thousands of Poles perished, has continued to hang over ties between the two nations and become more prominent ahead of the July 11th anniversary of one of the bloodiest days of a series of killings that took place from 1943 to 1945. Polish historians say that up to 12,000 Ukrainians were also killed in Polish retaliatory operations. The massacre caused an unusually public row between Poland and Ukraine earlier this year, after a Polish foreign ministry spokesman said that President Zelensky should apologize and ask for forgiveness for the events in Volhynia.
Нашого земного паломництва всі ми зустрінемося.
Elsewhere, NATO leaders gathered in Vilnius this week, aiming to overcome divisions on Ukraine's push for a path to membership and end Turkey's bloc on Sweden joining the transatlantic military alliance NATO. Now, the U.S. President Joe Biden, the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, French President Emmanuel Macron, and the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will be amongst the 31 NATO leaders attending the summit in the small Baltic state. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is also expected to attend and to press for Ukraine to be admitted into NATO soon after the war triggered by Russia's invasion comes to an end. NATO is expected to present a package of support to Ukraine at the summit, including an upgraded cooperation body, the NATO-Ukraine Council, and a bundle of non-lethal military aid to help Kiev's armed forces reform and reach NATO standards.
For 500 days, Moscow has brought death and destruction to the heart of Europe, seeking to destroy Ukraine and divide NATO. Our summit will send a clear message. NATO stands united, and Russia's aggression will not pay. And then the most urgent task, and all analysts agree on that, is that we will stand by Ukraine. We will provide support to Ukraine for as long as it takes, because unless Ukraine wins this war, there's no membership issue to be discussed at all.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden has arrived in the UK, kicking off a three-stop high-stake overseas trip with a London visit aimed at bolstering the U.S.-UK special relationship on the eve of a critical summit with NATO leaders. President Biden will meet with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and King Charles III today before departing for the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. According to a statement released by Prime Minister Sunak's office, the president and he are expected to discuss Russia's war in Ukraine, amongst other key topics, as well as discuss public and private sector efforts to combat climate change. The statement adds that the UK is Europe's leading NATO ally. In their words, we are the United States' most important trade, defense, and diplomatic partner. We are at the forefront of providing Ukraine with the support they need to succeed on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Turkish presidency's communications directorate has said President Erdogan has held a phone call with U.S. President Joe Biden in which they discussed Sweden's NATO bid. Erdogan told President Biden that Stockholm is taking steps in the right direction for Ankara to ratify its bid, referring to an anti-terrorism law. He also said these steps were not useful as Kurdistan Workers' Party supporters continue to hold demonstrations in Sweden. According to the presidency's report, that is the readout, the two leaders also discussed the delivery of F-16 fighter jets and Ukraine's status in NATO on their call. High above a railway, a bridge spanning a foaming river just outside the Arctic Circle, Finnish construction workers hammer away at a project that will smoothen the connection from NATO's Atlantic coastline in Norway to its new border with Russia. This short stretch of rail is the only rail link between Sweden and Finland. As the alliance reshapes its strategy in response to Russia's campaign, access to these new territories and their infrastructure opens ways for allies to watch and contain Moscow, and an unprecedented chance to treat the whole of Northwest Europe as one bloc. That's according to nearly 24 diplomats and military and security experts. If there was a conflict with Russia in the Baltic Sea area, where Russia has significant military capabilities at St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, the shipping lane NATO used for that exercise will be vulnerable. The east-west railway link across the high north will open up an alternative which could prove crucial. But that risk, too, may recede when Sweden joins NATO.
only major route for our supply is through the sea, and I think the Russians can quite easily interrupt the cargo transportation by the sea. So basically this northern route is the only accessible route after that.
We need electrification from the Kemi to the Haaparanta, and this is the missing part, last mile of the electrification, what is needed now, and it is now under construction. And also some bridges has to be done more robust that these new locomotives and also cargo can go across this bridge which goes over the border.
The Baltic Sea is as I said, it's a multi-domain area. It also can be easily described with what we call the 5 Cs: confined, confused, contested, congested, and cluttered. It's a very busy area. It's also confined in terms of the space, but it's also there's a lot of areas where we can hinder the opponent to move about on their own free will. So I would say that with 5 submarines, you can easily constrain the movements of your opponent.
Now, let's talk to Mr. Tony Agwans, researcher, senior lecturer, Anglia Ruskin University in London, joining us virtually from the UK. Good morning, it's good to have you. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning, Olumide, and how is Lagos this morning?
Well, very well, and we expect even better as the day progresses. Now, all roads lead to Lithuania for the NATO summit. The heavyweights are going to be there. Joe Biden is already in the UK, France, Germany, and the other NATO leaders. Their objective is quite clear: show support for Ukraine and do it in as pragmatic a way as possible, I expect, without letting Ukraine join until after the war. What are your thoughts as these countries gather?
Yeah, absolutely. You have put it very succinctly, Olumide. The NATO meeting, NATO summit coming up, beginning tomorrow in Vilnius in Lithuania is perhaps one of the most anticipated NATO summit in recent time, and for obvious reasons, because of the ongoing crisis between Russia and Ukraine, which has just crossed the 500 days mark. Okay, so everyone is expectant. There's a lot of anxiety, within several countries that make up the NATO alliance. Unfortunately, like you have alluded to, Ukraine is not a member yet, and they cannot even be a member while this crisis is on. So there's a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot of thought going on within the alliance as to what to do. A lot of the NATO alliance members are already reeling because this crisis, going close to 2 years now, they have all been supporting. And some of these things, they have their economic consequences. So everyone is asking for how long is this crisis going to go on. And then just a few days ago, the US, President Joe Biden, approved the supply of, cluster munitions, a bit rather reluctantly. I think his hand was forced. They don't really have a choice. So there's a lot going on, and the meeting starting tomorrow in Lithuania is going to stretch the unity of the NATO alliance. So we watch and see.
It's good that you bring up the supply of cluster munitions to Ukraine by the US, because now the Cambodian Prime Minister has weighed in and he's all but begged Ukraine not to use those munitions, because he's rightly pointed out that the munitions dropped in Cambodia in the 1970s are still being felt in Cambodia up till this present day. Thousands of people have lost their lives from the unexploded ordnances of these munitions, and he was actually appealing to the Ukrainian president not to use these weapons, because at the end of the day, the Ukrainians themselves will be the one bearing the short end of the stick. These munitions will fall in places where they will not be found or discovered, and for up to 100 years, they can remain unexploded and keep exploding as time goes by. So you said just now that he doesn't have a choice. Did he really not have a choice? That is President Biden?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, he did have a choice, but military experts, have looked at these cluster munitions that the U.S. is supplying to Ukraine. It has its pros and cons. If you ask me personally, I would say there is no point using it. But I'm not a military general, so I think the understanding is that the Ukrainians are not doing as well as the West and NATO as they thought. Even the counteroffensive has been rather slow. So it's a case of, standing between the devil and the deep Red Sea, as is often said. And also, they will just have to live with the consequences if Ukraine eventually use these cluster munitions. Like you have said, Cambodia, even in Afghanistan, when some of these things were used, we also saw the devastating consequences, almost like landmines, and they always, kind of destroy civilians, they kill civilians, especially children who play around. So it's a very tight corner for the Ukrainians. And the truth of the matter is that I personally don't think they should have used it, but we cannot really, put a finger on it to know exactly what is happening on the field there in Ukraine, because, like we all know, over 120 countries in the world, banned the use of these cluster munitions. And interestingly, it is only the US, Russia, and Ukraine that didn't sign that, convention or treaty. So I don't know how that one happened. So this is where we are. But let's hope that they eventually don't use it, because the after effect is going to be too much to handle.
Cambodia itself also is reported not to have signed that treaty on the ban on the use of cluster munitions. But let's stay with it for an instance. One of the NGOs that help to demine countries that have been inundated with these mines, of which Cambodia is one of them. It's been totally inundated with these mines, and the land has been corrupted. It's affected their agriculture, affected their housing, affected their waterways. It's affected all spheres of life, and the country can't really move forward without demining all these areas. Now, sometime in January, it was reported that Ukrainian officials left Ukraine and went to Cambodia to see how the Cambodians and how the agencies that were responsible were helping to demine Cambodia. So it seems to me that they've thought this through and they want to go ahead with the risk. But in your view, does the risk outweigh the reward?
I think you are right there. This is just the humanity in me speaking now. I don't think the risk is really worth it. But if you look at it, the Ukrainians have been asking the Americans for this cluster munitions for a very long time. They've been the one asking for it. But the US, President Joe Biden was reluctant to approve this equipment to them. But what I think that has made the US to do this, like I said earlier, is the fact that all may not be going well, on the ground with the Ukrainian push, against the Russians inside Ukraine. So it's a case of, let's take the last resort. So the truth of the matter is that people are being killed anyway. Even last night, some humanitarian workers were killed. due to, a missile attack from Russia, in Kyiv. So the Ukrainians are saying that people are being killed, our people are being killed. So we are ready to face the consequences of having these munitions in our land and around our space. So I don't think when you look at this scenario, it's really, really difficult to fathom what the long-term effect is going to be. But like I said, let's just hope that they eventually don't deploy them. It could just also be a military tactics, to send a message to the Russians that we are backing the Ukrainians. That may just be a message that the Americans are trying to send. If you look at the UK here, the UK Prime Minister is not even in support. A lot of countries in the West are not in support. So it is a very dicey moment for both the Ukrainians and the Americans who have approved these cluster munitions and bombs.
In the meantime, the Ukrainians have accused the Russians of using cluster munitions so far during this war, so it's good to keep that in mind. Now, let's turn to the NATO summit. And also, we're going to have a retired military personnel in Nigeria who served in the U.S. Army in the course of this program today, so he'll perhaps give us a more militaristic point of view concerning the munitions deployment. But Mr. Agwans, to the NATO summit now, and on the sidelines of this meeting, obviously, or maybe even it'll be front and center, the bid of Sweden to join NATO. Turkey's going to be there, and Erdogan as well, we expect. Do you think that the other nations will be able to sway Turkey to not veto Sweden's application and ratify it in view of the fact that they are still accusing Sweden of harboring anti-Turkey elements in Stockholm?
Yeah, I think when you look at the body language of the Turkish president, he's just, trying to play the last card. He has his good reasons, for, not, assenting to the Swedish becoming part of the NATO alliance. But there's been a lot of diplomatic underwork going on out to this summit. I have the feeling that at the end of this summit, Sweden would most likely, on a scale, I would say 7 out of 10, Sweden will become the next member of the alliance. There's been a lot of, diplomatic discussion going on behind the scene. And I believe that Sweden will be part of NATO, hopefully after this meeting. I think they've met all the other criteria. And with this war in Ukraine, it shows that, countries can be attacked, by countries with bigger military strength, which Russia have done to Ukraine now. So, and you can see the cost to the world economy. So I believe that Turkey, they will relax their, their restriction. They will relax their, deference to, Sweden joining NATO. I think it will happen during this summit.
But why do you think Sweden is taking such a long time to quieten the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party? That's the PKK, the ones with whom Turkey have a grouse, and demonstrations are still going on there. If NATO membership is so important to Sweden and the Kurdistan Workers' Party is so offensive to the Turks, then why is Sweden not quietening them down so that they can get their membership ratified?
Yeah, Sweden has been doing their best to quieten the PKK. But, in a proper democracy like you have in the West, and Sweden inclusive, it's not always very easy to clamp down on free speech, demonstrations. It's not easy because of all the legal frameworks, democratic practices and all that. So that has been the challenge before Sweden. But that notwithstanding, when you look at some of the benefits, like, Sweden It's one of the developed countries among the Scandinavian nations. They will also bring a lot, of expertise, a lot of, economic assurance to the NATO alliance. So when you look at it, putting all this package together, like I said, Turkey will not have any other reason to keep, preventing Sweden from joining. And moreover, if you look at Turkey now, the president, Erdogan, he has just won re-election. So I believe he knows that he's got another 5-year term. So he's a bit more relaxed. And I believe Turkey will give their assent and Sweden will become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, following this meeting in Lithuania.
And all eyes remain on that meeting as it unfolds. Thank you, Mr. Agwins. Mr. Tony Agwins, always a pleasure. Researcher, senior lecturer, Anglo-Ruskin University, London.
Thank you, Olumide. Have a great day.
You too. After the break, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says West not fulfilling conditions for grain agreement renewal. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of our Russian invasion of Ukraine coverage today. The White House has defended its decision to send cluster munitions to Kiev, in spite of concerns about civilian casualties, as the Russian embassy has condemned the move. Speaking in an interview, National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, John Kirby, said Russia is already using the weapons and indiscriminately killing civilians. Cluster munitions scatter bomblets across large areas that can fail to explode and impact and can pose a long-term risk to anyone who encounters them, similar to landmines. Over 100 countries, including the UK, France, and Germany, have outlawed the munitions under the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but the US, Ukraine, and Russia are not signatories to the ban. The Ukrainians and the Russians have used cluster bombs since Moscow's forces invaded in February 2022. More recently, Ukrainian forces have begun using Turkish-provided cluster munitions on the battlefield. Russia claims. Russia's embassy in Washington on Sunday claims the U.S. had de facto admitted to committing war crimes by approving the supply of cluster munitions to Kiev. In a statement on Telegram, the Russian embassy said it had been paying attention to statements by U.S. spokesperson John Kirby. The Russian embassy claimed the United States is committing war crimes in the Ukrainian conflict, adding the U.S. is ready to annihilate all life far from its own borders and are using the Ukrainians to do it. It comes as the U.S. confirmed that it will send the cluster munitions to Ukraine as part of a new military aid package following months of debate within the Biden administration about whether to provide Kiev with the controversial weapons. With just 1 week to go before a key grain agreement allowing Ukraine to export the commodity across the Black Sea expires, Russia's foreign minister told his Turkish counterpart that the West had not met Russia's demands for an extension. Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov complained to his Turkish counterpart Hakan Fidan in a phone call that conditions had not been met. These include dismantling sanctions that prevent Russia's exports of grain fertilizers. Now, Turkey brokered the original deal along with the United Nations. Its termination, which Russia has repeatedly threatened, may lift global food prices given Ukraine's importance as an exporter of grain. Now we're pleased to speak with Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain and national defense and military strategist, joining us from Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory, north-central Nigeria. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Olumide. And
I
good
think,
morning.
very good morning to you. I think it was in the Nixon presidency in the United States that Vietnam was the order of the day. And because of Cambodia's harboring Vietnamese points where weapons were being dropped and surreptitious events of that nature, the US was bombing Cambodia with these cluster munitions. And 2023, and the Cambodian Prime Minister is still talking about how these munitions have affected the lifestyles and the entire livelihood of an entire country, even though it was dropped in certain areas. Now that the US has said that they will continue, they will go ahead and send these cluster munitions to Ukraine, what are your thoughts?
Okay. Again, good morning, and thank you for having me. I followed the discussion with the other gentleman that was in the UK. He did a very fantastic job. Look, the US president has said, look, it was a hard decision for him to make. It was a difficult decision. And that's why we elect presidents. We elect presidents to make the hard choices, make the hard decisions. If there were no hard decisions to be made, we probably don't need to be electing presidents. The truth of the matter is that, look, the Ukrainians have to first and foremost win the war. Ukrainians will have no country if they don't reclaim their territories that are under occupation by the Russians. If the Ukrainians don't fight, they may even lose the areas that are under their control right now. So the objective now is to be able to, equip them with necessary capacity to be able to fight off the Russians and reclaim their territories and deal with unexploded ordnances, which, as you people rightly mentioned during the first segment of this program, the Russians were already using in Ukraine. So what the Ukrainians are saying, look, we need these cluster munitions to be used in our own territory to be able to fight off the Russians and reclaim our own territory. Those territories, if they're not reclaimed by the Ukrainians, they will not be Ukraine. So first thing first, you have to use whatever arsenal is at your disposal to win this war, after which you deal with the aftermath of the use of those cluster munitions that you're talking about. But let us go down. Look, it's not always in every case that those munitions don't explode, okay? That is the whole misconception about this whole discussion, is that, people think that as soon as you just drop them, there will be millions of unexploded ordnances of those sub-munitions. No, that is not always the case. It's always in a few instances that, a few of them do not explode, okay? So they're usually very effective. The Russians have been using them to, obliterate Ukraine. So I don't see the reason why, if the Ukrainians are asking for it, they shouldn't be able to use it. So I think it was a hard decision by the US president, but it was a right decision to be made. That is one point. Another point is that, look, these people are exhausting their ammunition at a very fast pace than is being produced even amongst the Western allies. So as the President of the United States mentioned, it's a stopgap measure so that the ongoing counteroffensive can continue while defense industries in the US and within NATO and the Western allies are able to produce enough munition to continue to support this operation. I've said it in my previous appearances, Western alliance has the key to ending this conflict that we have that is ongoing right now. And the way this conflict is going to end is if Ukraine fight off Russia enough to the point that Russia will now realize that, look, the best option for us is to come to the negotiating table. At this point in time, NATO and the Western Alliance are not doing enough to get the Ukrainians to get to that point where they will put, Russians on the back foot, thereby forcing them to come to the negotiating table. And so some of all these restrictions that are placed on Ukraine are the reason why this ongoing conflict is still continuing, because there is not enough pressure being put on Russia. It's a much more bigger military and much more powerful military than the Ukrainians. So for them to be able to match, for the Ukrainians to be able to match them, they'll have to get additional capacity and support from the West. And by the way, every day Ukrainians are running for cover in their own country. And the Russians are in their own country going about their normal businesses. If I am, at the position where these decisions are being made, I think that it is time for even the Russians to be running for cover in their own country, because Ukrainians cannot be, running for cover every day. And the Russians are going about their normal businesses, so it's not a fair conflict.
Are you saying that the end, therefore, justifies the means? Because obviously, if they do this, then their own people will suffer in the long term. And you said that in your submission just now that it's not all cases that those ordinances remain unexploded, but they don't explode. So, but we have on record that it's almost a given fact that a lot of them don't explode, and it happens for many, many years. And that's why the Cambodian president was appealing to the Ukrainian president. Are we saying also, or are you saying that there's no other alternative to these munitions that can help to drive the counteroffensive?
Well, you see, you've alluded in your previous segment of this discussion, the Russians are already using this. And even the Ukrainians are also already using that from the ones that were supplied by the Turkish. So by Turkey. What I'm saying is that from what the President of the United States has said is that it's a stopgap measure for the counteroffensive to continue to progress, while the defense industries in the West are able to produce enough ammunition to supply to the Ukrainians to continue the fight. What I'm saying is that, look, Ukrainians will not have a territory, they will have no country if they don't win. Those areas that are under occupation by Russia will cease to be part of Ukraine if Ukrainians don't win. So what I'm saying is that the Ukrainians have to do whatever it takes, because the Russians already do whatever it takes to make sure that these areas do not fall back into the hands of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians themselves have a right to also project enough power to push the Russians out of their territories before those territories can now become part of Ukraine again, before we can now talk about unexploded ordinances. You have to first and foremost win. If they don't win, those areas are Russian territories. And so if you are a Ukrainian and these are your options, you have to do whatever it takes. The West has said, look, we don't have enough munition to supply you right now. The Ukrainians are asking for this munition as a stopgap measure to continue their counteroffensive until such a time that the defense industries in the West are able to produce enough conventional munition and then supply them. By the way, you also alluded to the fact that, look, the Ukrainians are not signatory to that convention. The Americans are not signatories to that convention. The Russians are not signatories to that convention. The Russians are already using it. The Ukrainians are already using it. So the only issue now is that the Americans want to supply the Ukrainians the same cluster munition that they have been using, that the Russians have been using. So the only strange factor here now is that America is supplying it to the Ukrainians. That is the only strange factor right now.
As the NATO summit holds in Lithuania now, is there a concern from you that it'll all be about offensives and not about mediation? Do you see any of these countries looking to see how both parties can come to the negotiation table?
Well, even before now, even before the NATO summit, there have been efforts that have been made in the past. I believe, and they continue to make effort I believe that at the end of the day, this whole conflict is going to end up on a negotiating table. That's where this whole thing is going to be settled at the end of the day. Before now, there had been ongoing discussions on diplomatic solutions to this conflict because that's the only solution. But so as long as, the two parties still have the capacity to continue the conflict will continue until such a time that one of the parties has been put in a position where it cannot, progress anymore. That's when negotiation will take place. At this time, I don't think they are at that point yet. The Ukrainians want all their territories that had been taken over by Russians, they want them back. The Russians on their own are fighting hard to continue to control those territories. So the two parties, I don't think any side is ready for negotiation yet. But I want to assure you that with time, they will get to a point that there must have to be diplomatic solution, which means negotiated solution to the problem. But
Captain
I don't
Johnson.
think at this point that they've reached that point. So yeah, there have always been ongoing discussion on diplomacy and negotiation, even before
Captain
the
Johnson.
NATO summit.
Captain, you're a soldier.
Yes.
You're retired, but they say once soldier, always a soldier, right? So,
Correct.
Yes. Can you tell me, with this deployment of cluster munitions, and we've been reporting the increased tempo of fighting on multiple fronts from both sides as at today, do you think this is disheartening for the soldiers on the battlefield? Is this scary for them when they hear that, okay, there's going to be this whole deployment of cluster munitions from America to the Ukrainian hands? Do you think it's disheartening for the Russian soldiers, and it'll help in the Ukrainian counteroffensive? Can you tell us the human elements of how all this news of these weapons deployment affects a soldier on the battlefield?
You see, most times, as far as the soldiers are concerned, most times some of this conflict is all about morale of the soldiers at the war front. It's all about their morale. And whenever there's an increased capacity or, assets, it boosts your morale. It means that you achieve most of your objective. The most demoralizing thing to a soldier is when you're not able to achieve your objective. Say, for example, your objective is to secure a particular building and you're unable to secure and clear that particular building, it demoralizes that soldier. Now, but if you're constantly achieving every objective, every assignment that is given to you, it boosts your morale. And in fact, you will feel invisible in most times because you are always accomplishing those objectives that are assigned to you. And so what this cluster munition is going to do to the Ukrainians is that it's going to add to their capacity and their capabilities. And so they will be able to accomplish some of the things that they have not been able to accomplish up to this time. If you have been following the counteroffensive has been very slow. And expectedly, it has to be slow, because this is something that has been made public for a very long period of time. I'm fighting with you, and you're telling me, look, I am planning to come and do A, B, C, D. I will plan against your A, B, C, D. I'll wait for you. And so that is what has happened. One of the best elements in conflict and military operations is the element of surprise. But that particular element was removed in this particular counteroffensive because the counteroffensive went public. Most of the things that the Ukrainians were planning, the Russians were also planning for the counter of the counter-offensive. So as a consequence of that, the counter-offensive by the Ukrainians are slow. So they will need some kind of capability that will prop them up to be able to proceed faster than they are proceeding right now. If they continue to proceed at the rate in which they are proceeding right now, they are progressing right now, it will lead eventually to demoralization amongst the soldiers. And that is not a good thing that you want to have if you're a commander. It's demoralized soldiers. You don't want to have that. And so the cluster munition, because they're effective. Everybody's crying about it because they're effective, right? It's effective. You spray it over a wide area. and you achieve your objective. Yeah, there may be 1, 2, 3 of those sub-munitions that will not, or bomblets that will not explode, but you have to weigh what you want to achieve and the unexploded ordnances that you have to deal with later. You have to weigh both of them and see which one weighs higher for you.
Exactly. We understand that in Cambodia, there's an explosion every week since 1970s concerning these unexploded ordnances. But we'll leave it there, and we thank you so much for your perspective and contribution. Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain and national defense and military strategist who joined us from the nation's capital, Abuja. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Olumide. Thank you for having me.
After the break, we'll have some business analysis from our business correspondent Laddie Williams to see how the world of business is affected by the conflict in Ukraine. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over 500 days into this war, 502 or 3 days to the day. And we're looking at how the business world is affected by this conflict. Laddie Williams, our business correspondent, is with us in the studio.
Good morning.
Laddie, 500 days is a lot.
It's a long time.
And while that is happening, the studies are showing an increasing number of countries are repatriating gold reserves as a way of protection.
Right, yeah.
Protection from what? Global inflation, global fear?
So at the end of the day, it's fear that what happened with Russia, because with the sanctions we've seen on Russia after they invaded Ukraine, about half of their foreign reserves that was seized, that they had in foreign countries. They had about $650 billion there. But half of that seized, at this point, due to the sanctions we're seeing from the West. And this survey by Invesco, shows that most central bankers and sovereign fund traders at this point are looking at this whole, keeping your reserves in another country. They're seeing the risk, there, because if you annoy maybe the West at some point with some of your policies, there's a risk that they might just, seize your foreign reserves, like we see with what's happening with Russia right now.
So we're talking about the form in which they are kept?
So the thing is that you keep some of your reserves in other countries to protect, your sovereign funds. That's for your country. So Russia has about half of that, about $650 billion. They have half of that in other countries, in gold, in US dollar, and other foreign currencies. So we've seen the West seize some of those funds, trying to use that fund to rebuild Ukraine because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this survey is basically telling us how central bankers globally are feeling about this. So now the mantra is, if it's my gold, then I want it in my country. So if you have your gold,
they're leaving the cash and they're taking back their gold.
So now they're repatriating more gold, into their their reserves domestically at this point. So the survey, showed about 60% said gold is more attractive, at this point, because with your gold you can keep it, your country. You don't have to, because if it's fiat, then there is that risk. When you get sanctioned by the West, there is that risk you might not get your fiat at this point. Then we saw about 68% said they were keeping their reserves at home, compared to 50% from 2022. So we're seeing the trend now with central bankers. You know what? Let's keep more of our reserves at home. Because before it was normal to keep most of your reserves outside your country as a form of mitigating risk to your foreign reserves. So now, We're seeing that change gradually because of geopolitics. Yeah, keeping it at home.
Like the U.S. keeps its gold at Fort Knox?
Exactly. Something like that. So now it's more like, just like you have in the world of cryptocurrency, they say if it's not your keys, that means if you're not the one holding your funds, then there is a risk that you will lose your funds. So now we're seeing that mantra now, just because of geopolitics. So we're seeing, this just shows the impact of, geopolitical tension, at this point. It's showing that, central bankers are changing, how they want to keep, their reserves at this point. You keep it with you, or do you keep it outside the country?
And there's no disadvantage to that, is there?
So there's a little risk there, when you keep all of your, reserves in your own country. There's a risk that if, how you have issues in your country, there's a risk those funds, you might not be able to, use some of those funds in the international market. So keeping it outside your shores, it's some kind of, it's like a buffer. At some point, if your country goes into any issues along the way, then you have those funds, waiting for you outside, your country. But now it's becoming more risky with, what we're seeing with Russia's about half of their foreign reserve, stock right now outside, and they can't use it. They have no access to it at this point.
That's a lot to ponder about.
Yeah.
The Black Sea grain deal runs a risk of not being renewed.
Yeah.
And Russia is maintaining its position that, look, you're not giving us what we want.
Right.
We're not going to give you what you need.
Exactly, and yeah, it's that time again when we want to. Everyone's looking at that renewal of the Black Sea grain deal. It's supposed to be renewed next week, about July 17th. So now we're seeing that whole drama again. We'll see before, the renewal. And this time, we're seeing, Russia, they're putting their foot down now, and it's looking like they might not want to renew it, this time. And obviously, we see the benefits, of the grain deal. It's definitely going to prevent, global hunger, because these two countries are the biggest exporters of wheat at this point. And Middle Eastern countries rely on that wheat, West Africa, So at the end of the day, this time, the issues between, right now, what analysts see that if Putin and Erdogan are not able to, reach a consensus, there's a huge possibility that they might not renew it, next week. And we're already seeing, grain prices, wheat prices, starting to react,
Already, even though that hasn't happened.
Even though it hasn't happened.
So what's the worst case scenario?
So the worst case scenario is that wheat prices, start to skyrocket again. We saw it hit a high about $12 in 2022. Now we're back to about $6, for a bushel of wheat. So we're hoping those prices, stay lower, but it all depends on what happens with negotiations between Putin and Erdogan of Turkey.
Okay, Ladi, we'll keep our eye on it.
Yeah.
And also, Business Morning happens after this program.
Exactly.
We'd like our viewers to please stay tuned for that. Our business correspondent, Ladi Williams.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Ladi.
Thank you.
Now, from there, we'll just take our final story. 5 former commanders of Ukraine's garrison in Mariupol have returned home from Turkey. President Vladimir Zelensky brought them back in a highly symbolic achievement that Russia said violated a prisoner exchange deal engineered last year. President Zelensky gave no explanation for why the commanders were being allowed to return home now, and also Turkey's Directorate of Communication is mum about the return. A ceremony to welcome home the soldiers was later held in Lviv, where President Zelensky made an address commending the men as heroes. That's it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Many thanks to you, our viewers, our producers, and our guests for being a part of the program today. See you again tomorrow. Have a good day.